Okay, before we can proceed much further with talking about how we format text with CSS, we should talk a little bit about web fonts in general and fonts in general. And I want to thank here Renee Burrell, um, my predecessor here who designed some of these classes, for her help on this on this presentation. So we should know, and you've already seen reference to things like serif and sans serif. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generic font families in the world, general, overall. And we think about these when we think about CSS and we think about fonts. We have purposes that we use all of these, or might use any of these on your even in your resume or on some other pages. But in general, overwhelmingly, you're going to use sans serif fonts and maybe just one sans serif font on your entire resume. That's fine. In fact, using a lot of different type for no good reason, it looks kind of amateurish. Yet there might be reason to use some of these other generic groupings here for particular purposes. Let's go into some detail on these. First, serif. What does serif mean? The serif itself is the little tiny strokes, little tiny, like the little curly cues and little feet and little details on this type right here, for instance. And other common examples would be Times New Roman, Georgia, and many, many, many more. If you have the characteristic, then that font family, if it has serifs, it is called a serif font. Okay? Serif fonts are best used in print and extremely common there. Most books and newspapers and magazines that you read use a serif font. Almost all your textbooks do. I think that we might be heading into a bit of a trend where we're moving. It's a little bit less common, but it's still extremely common. Our eye is really used to reading serif fonts, but here's the problem. They require really high resolution. Those little details, those little curly cues, those little things, which are so beautiful to look at, are harder to reproduce properly, especially at smaller size, on digital displays. Websites, stuff you look at on a screen, does not have anywhere near the resolution, the clarity that print does. Print has more. So that's why we may use them sparingly. We might use serif for a header or two on a website, but we don't use them for all the bulk of the copy that we read. As you can see, the bulk of the copy you're reading here is a sans serif. Only this header is a serif. Use it sparingly. Sans serif fonts are essentially just fonts that don't have the serifs, are called sans serif. That's sans with an S, well, with more than one S. Sans serif. It comes from the French, it means without serifs. On the web, these because serifs are more difficult to read, sans serif fonts are your web workhorse fonts. That would be your most common font. In fact, you may just pick a sans serif font and use that throughout your website for headings and for a regular reading copy and for captions and for whatever. However, just because they are without serifs doesn't mean that they're all identical. Although, frankly, it takes a little become a little familiar with them to see the differences between perhaps Arial and Verdana, for instance. Some are wider and some are narrower. Like Verdana is a wider font, and Arial is a narrower one. And Arial is kind of the digital and Microsoft version of Helvetica, which is another famous sans serif font. So expect to use this a lot and maybe even exclusively. Monospace fonts come from an interesting background. They're very mechanical and machine-like looking, as you see here. And that's because they were made for machines. They were made to be mechanical. They were made for what we call optical character recognition machines to be able to read type, actually feed it into a machine where it's scanned and understood. And as a result, they're made to be extremely regular. That means that the space that each character inhabits is the same. That's really weird when you think about it, because like a lowercase I and then a capital M take up huge amounts of different space. But in a monospace font, every letter takes up exactly the same amount of space. They can be interesting looking occasionally for like maybe a single header or something, but they're actually hard to read. So you would definitely never use them for like actual paragraphs or big chunks of text. Maybe a heading. Some common examples, Courier and OCR. Cursive fonts, which some people call script fonts, are made to look like handwriting. They imitate handwriting. And as a result, when we get into the cursive, and then afterwards later into the more fantasy related fonts, there's some really big differences between the parts of this family, between the fonts that are within it. So in other words, Comic Sans is extremely different from Edwardian. You can get some fonts in this family which are so curvy and flowery and wildly designed that they're very hard to read. In fact, in general, they are hard to read. All right, but maybe you have a reason you want to use some kind of a cursive font maybe for your H1 or something like that. Keep in mind that because so many script fonts are so specialized, they are not found on all computers. In general, you'll see how we can be pretty well assured of getting either exactly the serif or sans serif fonts you're looking for, or something very similar to it. We'll use something called a font stack. But there is not any good font stack for cursive, for instance. So that means that when you want a cursive font, you want a particular cursive font. And if you do want one, you really should try a web font, which we'll talk about later, how we get web fonts, or you build a font into an image. Like in a banner, you actually turn the font, make it look exactly the way you want it, and then turn it into an image and put that image on the top of your page. So we use cursive fonts very sparingly, if at all, and there's some examples, Comic Sans, Edwardian, and many others. And then there's fantasy. Some people call this decorative. Some people call it novelty. These fonts, like the cursive, should be only used for decorative titles and headings, if at all. Used very sparingly, if at all. And again, like cursive, if you really want a specialty fantasy font, you should probably try a web font or not probably, for sure, either use a web font or build it into an image. In other words, we don't just call for this font in regular font command in CSS. One reason is there's no generic one because they're all over the place. So what kinds of stuff? Stuff that looks like animals is a fantasy font. Stuff that looks like old-fashioned Art Deco is an animal font. Stuff that looks like Gunsmoke Western stuff is a fantasy or decorative or novelty font. Some are actually made to be completely unreadable, like wingdings, which are just symbols. That's a kind of a fantasy font. So you use these with caution. If you want a fantasy font, you certainly want a particular one for a particular reason, and only use it a little bit. So you're going to use a web font, or you're going to use an image. All right, when we think about fonts, when you choose the fonts for your resume or something else in the future, you have two big things to worry about: readability and legibility, and they are different. Readability is how easy it is to read lines and scan blocks of text. To improve readability, we avoid very long lines. We use headings to break up big chunks of text. In other words, we don't just have like huge paragraph after paragraph. We put headings in there to break it up. We use white space to allow the eyes to rest. White space just means it doesn't have to be white. It's just space where we don't have other stuff. That other stuff is almost always images or text. And we're cautious with alignment. Regular left alignment, which is what you're all used to reading most paragraphs and everything else, is easiest to read. Centering is okay perhaps for a single line. That might be a short captions or maybe a single header. Right alignment should generally be avoided. There might be some rare cases to use it, but it's very hard to read. We would never center or right align like entire paragraphs or larger chunks of text. That's readability. Legibility is how easy is it for you to pick out individual letters. And this is a real issue will be in the future when you move into CSS with your resume. is you want to make sure you have really good contrast between your text and your background. So you either have white text on a dark background or dark text on a very light background. Usually the default is dark text, which would be black, on a very light background, which would be white or close to it. But you do have to pay attention to what happens with different contrasting colors. Realize that in the what we call a reverse, which is white text or very light text on a dark background, the text looks smaller. In fact, you're probably going to have to make it bigger and or bolder to make it readable. But whereas the same text on a light background, if it's dark, looks bigger. Also, speaking of colors, bright colored text, especially large chunks of it, can be really hard to read. And anything that gets to be like red, which bleeds out onto the background and gets to get kind of fuzzy, things that are neon or weird, very bright colors are very hard to read. So we use them very sparingly, if at all. In general, we use black or white or things that are just nearly black or nearly white. More about legibility that make the individual characters stand out. Never set large amounts of types in all caps or small caps. In other words, the normal upper-lower type is what we want for paragraphs and big chunks of text. Yeah, a heading might be all caps or something, and bold and italics is fine in a very small amount, but not for large amounts. Same thing for the fantasy or cursive families. Those are very hard to read. Hard to distinguish individual letters. And about design, text and design. Well, overall, fewer font choices are probably better. You should use the same 1 or 2 font choices throughout your site, which in your resume is your site. But that applies to other sites too. Likewise, you use the same font colors. So the font colors should be consistent. If you use a certain color on an H2, it's probably on every H2. Excuse me about that pop-up. So be consistent with the colors you use and the way you use type. Trust your eyes. Make the type easy to read. If it's not easy to read, then fix it. Remember, your font choices set a tone, a style, so we take control of them. In fact, we take control of everything. Every element we should be controlling it with CSS, the presentation of it. And it definitely goes for fonts. We make sure every font is we choose the font itself, and then we take control of it and we say exactly what size we want it to be. But always readability and legibility are the most critical, rather than style and design just for their own reason, just for their own purposes. It has to be readable, it has to be legible. Okay, type in CSS. Let's look at some of the commands that we use in CSS to apply to type. This is a lot, I know, and you've read it. I'm just going over it again. I'm actually much less is in the chapter, but this is definitely a huge category of how we style type. So this is how we choose a font. We use a font family command in CSS, font family. And you've seen this already in some things you've already made. And we'd start with the body, and we apply a font family, and then we would call for the font. Do notice, we'll see in a minute, that the way we write fonts in CSS is very particular. Okay. But here's the problem. What if the person who's looking at your website, what if their computer doesn't have Arial? What's going to happen? You don't know. So you need to take control of that, right? And we do that with something called a font stack. A font stack is a list of fonts. And we do something just like this for the body, and you're going to do it in your resume. What it means is we say, I want to apply a font family to the body, which is everything, right? And it's going to inherit down through the entire body. And what I really want is the first font, Universe, for instance. But if they don't have it, okay, I'll take this font. They don't have it, okay, I'll take this font. They don't have it, okay, I'll take this font. They don't have it, okay, I'll take this font. And finally, if they don't have any of those, I'll take this last choice. All right, so it's kind of a process of elimination. You have your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, and in the end, you at least get something that is sans serif, a default. If there's some weird computer that doesn't have any of the types that you called for. Now, font stacks are designed so they cover lots of different operating systems and computer types with some very similar fonts. before we talk more about font stacks, and I show you this handout here, which is on Moodle, notice the way this is written, okay? First of all, fonts are real things that are capitalized. So font names are always capitalized. Okay, good. But sans serif is not, because it is not a font name. It is a generic category. Okay, good. Notice that in between each font is a comma. Fine. But for some reason, can you guess why? This one has quotation marks around it. Well, the reason is that it's a two-word font name. So whenever, but that's the real name of the font. It's two-word, like Times New Roman is a three-word font name. Whenever there's a font that has a multi-word name, CSS will understand it unless we put it in quotation marks. But here's the thing that will really get you if you are a grammatically correct writer, is in a font stack, we put the comma after the quotation marks. And all your other writing, commas should go inside quotation marks, be it journalism or anything else. But in CSS, we put the comma outside the quotation mark in a font stack. Okay, let me show you. There's a handout which is available near this video on Moodle, which is called, which I have now misplaced. Let me try to find it. Yep, EM Best Practices. There it is. Okay. Oh, I had it over here too. That's the resume 3. Sorry, wrong one. Oops, I'll have to get that and get back to you. Okay, this is something that is lacking from your current textbook, is the font stack explanation. This comes from the previous version of the textbook, but is available here on Moodle for you to look at. This sidebar, Best Font Stacks Ever, is extremely useful. And I think what you will do is you will pick one of these sans serif stacks. Now, you can also go to this link and learn more about font stacks, and you can do a quick search for best font stacks and get lots of other suggestions. But these have been pretty well put together. So if you want a wide sans serif stack, you will use this list of fonts. But again, whatever you do, don't just select it and paste it. You got to retype them. Okay. And if you want a narrow sans serif, which is kind of Arial based as opposed to Verdana based, you will use this list of this stack here. Whatever stack you use, you should have at least 5 fonts is the rule that I think we should be using. So that is I think you should, now let's say you decide to use a Times on one of your headings, you will use one of these, or well, a serif font. You'll use one of those. And then here's a monospace stack should you choose to use a monospace, which would be a little unusual, but it is possible, and you could still use a font stack. Truth is, whenever we use a font family command, we use a font stack. So, and again, there's more discussion about font stacks here. And in a minute, we'll come back to talk about EM measurements, which is also in this handout, in the EM best practices, which is what I want you to use on your resume. So let us continue then with trying to finish up this presentation, which is going on longer than I hoped. But I'm going to break off another presentation following this that'll go into more detail as you move into resume 3. Okay, so font family, font stacks, the punctuation, the capitalization, everything is extremely important. Font size. Okay, how we deal with sizing of fonts. Every element on your page that has type, every type-based element, should be sized. You need to take control of sizing. And I want you to use the EM best practices. And I will show you in Notepad++ a little later in the other presentation exactly how to do this. But here's the idea, and read this handout that I just showed you here about EM measurements and what they mean, and about EM best practices and how it works, down through to here. You can read about pixels there too, but EM practices and how it looks. So read about those. But let's just say, well, the idea is we set the body to 100%, which is essentially saying, let's start everything off at the same point, tell the font to be the size it wants to, and then we vary it by EMs. Something that's 2 EM is twice the normal size, 4 EM is 4 times the normal size, and so on. And we don't have to use just whole numbers. Of course, we do, 1.25 or whatever you want for sizing. That's how we're going to size, and you're going to need to size everything. And here's an example of how it works out. So I would say in the body, first I will pick my font family, and maybe I pick that one if you want a Verdana-based one. Then I'd say font size 100%. Okay, so this is one declaration, and then a second declaration, a group or a declaration block. Then I could say I'm going to say H1 to be this size, H2 to be this size, H3 to be this size, and then I might very well say on my reading copy, which might be paragraphs, LIs, DDs, DTs, to be this smaller size. We generally make things that are paragraphs around 1 EM, maybe a little smaller. I think 0.875 is okay, but maybe a little small. And then we make sure that things that are headings are gradated in sizes. We have the H1 is the biggest, H2 is the next biggest, H3 is the next biggest, and we take control of the sizes and decide what we want them to be. Font weight. If you want to bold something, it's called font weight. Bold and normal are the two most common values. There are ways to bold things with numbers, which you can read about and see. But if I want the H2 to be bold, or something else to be bold, I do font weight bold. That's how I do it. Font style is what we mean by italics. Italic and normal are the only two choices for font style. So really, it's just italicizing. If you want something to be italic, we don't use inline elements to make something italic. We use CSS to make it italic, if that's what we want. In fact, in the end, when you get done with your resume, you're going to use few, if any, of those style-like inline elements, really. Font variant is for small caps, which you can look at and read about. If you don't know what small caps are, just give them a try. You'd only use that for heading, perhaps, if at all, but that's what font variant is. Of course, you can change the font color with the color command, but do realize that the color command doesn't mean font color. It just means foreground color. Okay, there's a lot more to talk about with color. Next week, I think will be color. I think it's next week. Anyway, yeah, we're going to learn a lot more about colors. I've asked you, though, in Resume 3 to add some color, and you can go see the named colors on pages 304. Let me make sure I got those pages right. I'm looking through right now. 301. Oh yeah, there it is. 304 and 305. Those name colors. Those are easy to use until you learn more about color. So feel free to use those. Nothing wrong with those. Line height is something I want you to do as part of your resume, and I definitely want you to add extra line height to your regular paragraphs, list items, and DDs. We think about those things as the normal reading copy, but we don't use line height for spacing in general in our website. We use it for the space between lines and multi-line things. Paragraphs are the best example, but DDs and LIs could be multi-line things also. And we can use in a variety of ways. We could just give it a number, or give it the EM, or give it a percent, but it works out the same thing. 2 is double. And you're going to probably use something close to 2. Maybe not 2, maybe 1.75 or something. You'll play with it to find what you want. But we don't apply it to the body. We just apply it to the specific things that we want. Text indent. Sometimes people use this. If you want to be indented, like indented paragraphs, you can put an indent in there. Text align. Yes, you may want to center something like a heading, maybe your H1 or H2s or something. That's how you do it. The normal values are left, right, centered, and justified. You're probably not going to do any justified. You'll rarely do right. Left is the default anyway, so we don't usually use it because it's what happens without doing anything. So centering is the most common. Text transform means changing case. And here's where you might get confused between the difference between uppercase and capitalize. Uppercase means all caps. Everything's capitalized. Lowercase means all lower. Everything lowercase. Capitalize means the first letter of each word is capitalized. And then none means as typed. You don't have to put a none in here. You can just not do it at all. It's the default. And then we're getting towards the end here. You could also change the style of your bullets to squares, and there's other choices too. See those pages about that. You can also make your own bullets if you want to. So that would be for a UL, of course. Okay, that's a lot of stuff about text styling. I hope you've absorbed most of it as you're going to move on to your resume and start doing some of this stuff.